Draft season is right around the corner, and with the futures of a lot of these NFL prospects coming up, we wanted to talk about the futures of these NFL franchises as well. So, Amir, today we're going to be going through about 10 to 15 different franchises in the league and saying, hey, are we going to buy stock going into their futures, or are we going to sell it because we believe or we don't believe in their futures? Simple enough. You guys will pick up as we go on. But let's start off here with the New Orleans Saints. Last year they were 9-8. They have about $9 million in cap space, and of course you see some of their top guys there in the bottom, and that is, of course, going forward. But Amir, to me, the biggest questions with the Saints reside in their biggest two positions. Their head coach, not a big believer in Dennis Allen, and Derek Carr. Derek Carr's solid. He's a solid quarterback, but he's not a guy that's going to take you over the top with this veteran roster. Of course, they have a lot of salary cap issues as well. But your thoughts about the Saints? Do you think they have any chance to turn this into a contending team here in the next couple years?
Personally, I think they don't. The biggest reason why is, when they first got Derek Carr and first acquired him, I mean, the biggest problem was the contract. You go ahead and you pay all that money to that guy, with having all these veteran pieces around you. And, this team doesn't have enough cap space to really go out and add to this team around Derek Carr to make the situation best for him. I think for him, he's not great enough to bring you over the hump. And also, you can't go out and get some more, elite receivers or some more, great offensive pieces to kind of build around them. And that's like you just mentioned, Dennis Allen, they need to move on from him. I'm sorry, the Saints throughout this, throughout the year was a roller coaster ride. And, I think going into, this upcoming season, they're going to be this a middle tier mid team.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, the New Orleans Saints, excuse me, they have the 14th overall pick. A guy like Brock Bowers could possibly fall to that point where they could add another dynamic, threat to their offense. I would say a tight end, but he's not a tight end. He's kind of just a Weapon X kind of player. I hate to bring the comparison up, but he's kind of plays like a guy like Aaron Hernandez, Amir, where he can play in the slot. He can use him in motion, or of course he can play the traditional tight end role. He could be an interesting option, or they can go out and, of course, do what the Saints always do and get an offensive tackle. But they're in an interesting situation. But Amir, that leads us to our question: are you going to be buying or selling stock in this team for the next 2 to 3 years?
I will definitely be selling.
Selling the same thing here for me, but that is the general concept of this video. We're looking at the next 2 to 3 years, discussing what their roster looks like going forward, and of course, do we believe in them or not going forward? Basically, is the overall premise. For the Indianapolis Colts, again, they were also 9-8 last season, 18, just about $19 million in cap space going into next year. And they, of course, you see their top guys there in the bottom left as well. Two of those guys should be franchise cornerstones for the next 10 or so years, and Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson, if he develops the way that I believe he can. Amir, you're not as high on him as me, but regardless, right? The Indianapolis Colts are in a good situation. They have the 13th or the 5th, it's the 15th overall pick. So they can also go out there and add some pieces to this defense. But Amir, your thoughts on the Colts? And hey, Shane Steichen was very successful in his first year as a coach.
Yeah, like you just mentioned, I'm not as high on AR as you are, as many people are, but the thing is, I think Steichen's a great coach. And seeing this team win 9 games with Minshew at quarterback, in his first year, man, AR's gonna have no problem with this offense. You go ahead and you bring back Pittman, you still got Josh Downs, who I think is extremely underrated. And you also got JT, who should be healthier next year with a great O-line. I think once this team, drafts well, get some more defensive pieces like you just mentioned, this team will be absolutely great this upcoming year.
Yeah, Amir, big fans of guys like Quinyon Mitchell. He could be a guy that ends
Yeah.
up for the Colts. They desperately need a cornerback one next to Kenny Moore. A guy like Terrion Arnold could be a guy. Or hey, maybe they draft a guy like Brock Bowers. A lot of those guys are in the range for the Colts coming up, so it's going to be very interesting to see what they do here. And who knows, Amir? We might be talking about some draft stuff next week. We talked about that off the pod.
Yeah.
But buying or selling, I am going to buy stock in the Colts. I believe it might be a hot take, but I believe that this team can make the playoffs next year
Mhm.
as a 7 seed over a team
Yeah.
like Buffalo, over other teams like that. Because, of course, I'm also a believer the Jets can make some noise next year because they have the roster to do so. Again, I'm worried about their head coach. Regardless, the Colts, I do believe they have a chance to make the playoffs next year legitimately. But Amir, any dispute here? Do you think the Colts, are you not as high on them going forward as me?
Oh no, I'm buying too. The thing is, we talked about this when we were ranking, our teams, and the Colts was probably the trickiest team. We didn't know where to rank because they're a team that can either be really good just pushing that wild card ranking, or just be right outside of it. It was very tough for us to rank them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we had him at 16 or 17 with our averages, of course, for both of our rankings. If you missed that, go check out it. It was last week's video, if not 2 weeks ago. You can't miss it, right? It's a similar thumbnail to today's video. But let's talk about a division counterpart to the Indianapolis Colts. Another team, Amir, that was 9-8. I'm starting to think that I just messed up these records. Regardless, I have to go back and double check. Regardless, they have about $11 million in cap space. We're talking about the Jaguars. This offseason, they brought back Josh Allen, excuse me, rightfully so, but on a franchise tag, they didn't extend him. So that's a little bit worrisome going into next year. They lost Calvin Ridley, but that wasn't too big of a loss. And they brought in Gabe Davis. So that's pretty much what they did this offseason. They got Trevor Lawrence. Maybe an upgrade, you can say. Gabe Davis over Calvin Ridley. But going into next year, there's a lot of questions. Year 3 of Doug Peterson. Year 1, they look great. Year 2, not so much. So you going into year 3 with Doug Peterson, Amir, what version do you believe this team can look like? Year 1 or year 2?
I'm thinking year 2 and a little less. This team this past year, I understand Trevor Lawrence dealt with injuries. They were banged up. But, I mean, this team really didn't get much better this offseason. And the biggest concern going into this year is, me and you was talking about this a few weeks ago. We obviously have hope in Trevor Lawrence, but, I started to kind of question, is he overrated? Like where does he rank at, quarterbacks wise? And, I mean, this Jacksonville team, I mean, they have an entire receiver core full of wide receiver 2s and 3s. There's no difference maker on this offense. And I think that's the biggest concern for this team going into this year.
I mean, it might be a hot take. I personally am a Christian Kirk guy. I've always been since he came out of college. I would say he's the best receiver on this team. But again, you can make the argument for a guy like Gabe Davis, right? But the Jacksonville, they also have like a pick in the mid 20s. I want to say 23, 24. Regardless, they have a pick, or 17, excuse me. They have pick 17, and they're looking at a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson, some offensive line help for a guy like Trevor Lawrence. Like you mentioned there, Amir, Trevor Lawrence dealt with injuries. And just like the Bengals, these are two teams that for some reason just struggle to protect their franchise quarterback. But regardless, it'll be interesting to see how this team looks, and is it really going to be how this team looked 2 years ago or last year? That's going to be the biggest question. But I'm going to be selling the future or selling stock in this team for the next 2 to 3 years. I think they're in a very rough situation because after this year, let's say they do bad and they don't perform like they did 2 years ago and make the playoffs and almost win a first-round matchup, or when they did actually win the first-round matchup against the Chargers in that crazy comeback. I think if they don't do well this year, Josh Allen is a free agent. That's a huge top 5 edge in the game that you could lose. If Trevor Lawrence has another down year, is he actually the real deal? Can he be the franchise guy for a team? We're not doubting that he's good or he has the potential, but he needs to put it on the field. It'll be a very interesting year, but I just think that with other teams in this division getting better, it's hard for me to see a future where they can really be real contenders. But any additional thoughts here or any dispute here about selling the future of the Jacksonville Jaguars?
You just made a great point. Every other team in this division is getting better while they're getting worse. And that's a huge concern. You got the Colts and the Texans who have two, dynamic new quarterbacks coming in. And you got Jacksonville who's struggling to build around their franchise quarterback. And I think that's the biggest difference maker for me. And so I'll be selling.
I'll ask you this. Where does Trevor Lawrence rank as far as quarterbacks in that division? Where you have C.J. Stroud, Trevor Lawrence, you have, of course, Anthony Richardson and Will Levis. Where does he rank in that division? I mean, going into last year, it was clear cut. Trevor Lawrence and the Jags, best team, best quarterback in the division. This year, I guess you can have the question. So how would you rank those 4 guys?
I would definitely go ahead and put, Trevor Lawrence second behind C.J. Stroud, which is crazy putting a rookie over him. But I mean, personally, I think C.J. Stroud played good enough his rookie year to go ahead and put him over him.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. He was my number 6 quarterback on my rankings. A little bit overzealous for a guy like CJ Stroud, but when you just watch him, it's the same feeling I had with Joe Burrow. When you just watch him, there's just you have that feeling where it's just the it factor, right? This hypothetical it factor that we throw around in the world of sports. CJ Stroud just had it, and of course Trevor Lawrence I think has it as well. It's just we need to see it yet again because we haven't seen it in a long time. It feels like, but let's just keep it going in the AFC South, Amir. The Houston Texans will make this one quick. 10-7 last year. They beat the best defense in football in the first round, and they almost put up 50 points on them. They have about 17 million in cap this all or going into next year. Of course, their team is super young, super dynamic, and they're only going to get better, right? They traded down with the Vikings in their first round, so maybe they're not going to get a guy like Brian Thomas to complement Nico Collins and them. But going into next year, my only question is who's going to be the secondary option for CJ Stroud in this offense? Of course, Nico Collins is going to be their number one. They don't have that number one running back. Well, I guess actually, my apologies. They picked up Joe Mixon, but Tank Dell is probably going to be out for about half the season with that knee injury he had late last year. So who's going to be that secondary wide receiver in this offense? And of course, they have plenty of time to figure that out. But your thoughts about the Texans? We'll make it quick. Are you buying or selling stock in this team going forward?
I'm going to be buying for sure. You honestly brought up a good point. Who's going to be that receiver? And that's the only concern that I have. We kind of noticed a pattern with these top teams that's, pushing to make a huge run. They always have a number one guy that's a huge difference maker. And so, we don't know for sure if Nico Collins can, carry that load, especially waiting for Tank Dell to come back or how Tank Dell's going to be when he comes back. And so I think once Houston figures that out, it'll be absolutely scary.
Amir, my only thing too is also, and we saw this with Doug Peterson in his first year with Jacksonville. We see this also with rookie quarterbacks all the time. Is the consistency going to be there? Because now that teams have a full year
Yeah.
of tape on you, they know what you like, what you don't like. They know what your coach likes to do, what he doesn't like to do. And going into year two with a year two head coach and a year two quarterback, those are your biggest two positions on any team in football. And now, teams have some film on you. So how are you going
Yeah.
to bounce back? Or is the consistency going to be there? That's my other big question for the Houston Texans. For the Green Bay Packers, they have the best quarterback in football. Jordan Love, bona fide Hall of Famer. Amir, you can just give him the gold jacket right now. Now, I think, no,
Crazy.
I can't really make that argument after he played in the second half of that game against the Niners. But again, 9-8 last year. A lot of people had him winning 2, 3, 4 games. Nobody was the biggest believer in Jordan Love than I was. Of course, maybe outside of his family. I said that this team was going to be a 9-8 football team. They were 9-8 exactly. I didn't think they'd make the playoffs though, but they did, and they had a pretty big win in round one against the Dallas Cowboys, being the first ever 7 seed to win a first round matchup. But again, they have a lot of talented pieces going forward. Their defense is aging a little bit, Amir, but a very interesting offseason. Are you going to be buying or selling stock? Because again, they have the quarterback, at least presumably now, but the defense, there's some questions there.
I'm gonna be buying just for the simple fact that they won 9 games. You have your quarterback, and also the team has only gotten better. The biggest concern that I have is the receiving core, and also like you just mentioned with C.J. Stroud. J. Love, played great that second half. The second half of the season. Like that second half of the season was probably arguably the best in the league for any quarterback.
Yeah.
But the biggest concern that I have, that first half he looked human. And that was dealt with injuries and also dealt, with the receiving core, kind of not being up to par. And going into this year, I think they still need, a difference maker at receiver. Jaden Reed, these guys are great. Dobbs is great. But it's going to be kind of a lot tougher, to coming into this next year to have a better opportunity to win. I mean, like that game they had against San Fran, that was their arguably the best opportunity to go ahead and take it, and it's going to be tougher going into this next year.
Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in guys like Luke Musgrave or even like a Tucker Kraft. I think they have their tight ends for the future, of course. I am now more so excited to see what kind of receiver they can get because wouldn't it be
Mhm.
ironic? You get rid of Aaron Rodgers because he was frustrated. You just never gave him help on offense. And then you get a new quarterback, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to get him a weapon in year number 2. I would love to see that. Maybe a guy like Brian Thomas falls to that range. I would even be okay with a Keon Coleman, even though I'm not really too high on him. But the point I'm getting at is that Christian Watson to me is not a number 1 wide receiver. He is more so like a Gabe Davis, kind of a number 2
Yeah.
guy. But I don't see him being a number 1. And I think until you can go to that next level in this NFC, you need to have that number 1 wide receiver. So I'm excited to see who can either develop into that or who they can get to be that going forward. Who knows? Maybe a T. Higgins, right? But no doubt,
Yeah.
I'm a big Jordan Love fan. And again, like I've mentioned a couple times, the biggest 2 positions in football are your head coach and your quarterback. Packers seemingly have 2 great options going forward. So I'm going to be buying stock in them as well. For the Miami Dolphins, they had a record of 11-6 last year. Amir, at one point, they were the number one seed in the AFC last year, and they had what? I mean, again, this is a team that put up 70 points in a regulated game last year, no overtime. They dominated teams last year offensively. They reinvented the wheel with different offensive motions and all this funny stuff that Mike McDaniel brought to the game. So again, safe to say they were fun to watch last year. Jalen Ramsey came back and he dominated for a time period. But it's the same song and dance, Amir. They made it to the playoffs just
Mhm.
like the Cowboys. They had a good regular season, but they fell short. And whether that's the quarterback, the coaching, or whatever it may be, they just can't get the job done. So I'll ask you this. Are you buying or selling the fact that this team can maybe get it together next year? Maybe use Jalen Waddle a little bit more and get over the hump to be a contender because they have the offense to do so.
I'm selling the fact, and I tried to, sort of have tools back, 2 years ago, when he was an MVP candidate. They looked absolutely great. I think they started off with
I
eight
did
and
as
one,
well.
9-1, and then he ended up getting hurt, and then came back, still looked pretty solid. Got hurt again, going into this year, I kind of expected this Dolphins to improve everybody wrong, and this is a perfect example of stuff looking shiny on paper, and they hit the field and they play against a great competition and they fold. And that's the biggest concern with Tua. This team, I mean, really, they only have, limited chances now to really win. I
Yeah.
mean, the AFC even better this year. You got, even more teams up and coming going to be better. And, coming into this year, even your division is going to be better. And it's going to be even harder to make the playoffs. And so that's why I'm going to be selling the fact because, I think Tua is holding this team back.
Yeah, I think I'm in the middle, so I would say I'm split. And I'll say it for this reason. For one, I said that this team would disappoint going into last year. I said, hey, they might be fun, but my really goal for them going into last year was win one playoff game, get some confidence under your belt going into this year and next year, right? So I just wanted them to win one playoff game. They couldn't do that. But for the Miami Dolphins, I think it just comes down to the fact that it's alarming. They don't believe in their quarterback at the moment.
Mhm.
As Tua, they haven't extended him. Guys like Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert from that same draft class have gotten extensions, and rightfully so. But Tua hasn't, and he's in that draft class as well. He's due for a contract. He's going to the last year of his rookie contract, and the Miami Dolphins have scouts watching guys like Bo Nix and Michael Penix going into their pro days and to the draft combine, scouting these quarterbacks. I think it's alarming that they don't believe in the quarterback that they currently have. So I say all of that to say that for the Dolphins, I think the relying factor on if they can compete or not is who they have at quarterback, right? Just like any other team. And I don't believe Tua is the guy, like you mentioned there. You talked about a lot of great points. I don't think Tua is the guy to take you over the top. But are you going to be able to say that a guy like Penix or Bo Nix are going to be ready from day one to be able to take you over the top? I don't know. They'd have to have like a CJ Stroud effect from day
Yeah.
one. But the Dolphins were both selling the fact or selling their futures here for the next couple years. Going back to the Dolphins, also they lost Christian Watson, and if Tyreek Hill, apparently he's only going to play two to three more years, Amir, and then he might hang it up. So they have a lot of questions to answer there that we did not mention at first. But then we move over to the NFC side of things with the Minnesota Vikings, and this is an interesting one. Amir, I'll let you go first. But to me, they're 7-10. They have about $19 million in cap space. Of course, you see their top guys there. They have arguably the number one offensive player outside of the quarterback position in the game of football, and Justin Jefferson, let alone at the wide receiver position. They have TJ Hockenson, top five tight end. They have two top five tackles on the left and right side at their respective positions. They brought in Aaron Jones. They have the offensive line. They have the receivers and Jordan Addison as well. Defense, there's some questions, but they have time to address that. Also, they have a very good head coach. Interesting offseason ahead of them. But Amir, your thoughts on the Vikings? Would you buy or sell the fact that this team can really, compete for this division in the next couple years?
So, I was kind of, in the middle with this team. I didn't know where to lean towards, but, I mean, kind of looking at this team season, right? They kind of started the season off with the worst defensive football. Then, once, Kirk went down and Josh Dobbs came in, they kind of went through a stretch. The defense looked great. I mean, they honestly played great. And,
The NFL's
I,
weird.
exactly. It was really weird. Like through that stretch, I mean, they beat San Fran obviously in that stretch, and the defense looked amazing. And I think with this team, the biggest concern is quarterback, obviously, but my biggest concern is how are you going to keep your number one guy, happy, wanting to stay there, Justin Jefferson, and that's the biggest concern, But as the state of this team right now, I'm going to buy it just for the simple fact that they have some great pieces, they have some solid cap space, and I think once they address that quarterback situation, they build for the future. This team can honestly make some noise, so I'm going to be buying.
I was shocked to see that you were going to buy there, Amir, but I thought that, hey, coming into this video, I'm not the biggest JJ McCarthy believer, right? But at the same time, I'll say this, I'm not the biggest fan of him, but I am a believer in his game, if that makes any sense. If you want to hear all of my thoughts about JJ McCarthy, a shameless plug here. This past Monday, I released a video, 5-minute video. So if you guys want to check it out, it has of course, we talk about the pros of JJ, the cons of them, and of course, I gave you some draft comps as well. Safe to say, I'm a believer in JJ McCarthy. I believe that the Vikings have formed their offseason around the fact that, okay, Kirk Cousins is gone. Let's go get our next quarterback. And that next quarterback is going to be JJ McCarthy. They have 11 and 23 in the first round of this NFL draft. It's almost like written in stone right now that they're going to use those 2 picks to trade up into the top 5 and draft JJ McCarthy. And I think if you can get a guy like that comes into this offense and does exactly what he needs to do and do what he was asked to do, right? He's not trying to be Superman. He's going to do his job as a quarterback. I think this team can actually compete next year for the division. And it's going to be one of those oddball teams that we look at like they shouldn't really be here, kind of like the Colts last year when AR went down. They shouldn't really be here, but they are, and they're ready to compete either for a playoff spot or for the division. Again, that might sound crazy with teams like Green Bay, Chicago, and Detroit only getting better. But again, the NFL is weird, and I believe a guy like JJ could be that piece for them going into next year. But again, I'm going to be buying the fact as well going into the next couple years. Another team that opened up a lot of cap space for this season, the LA Chargers. They're 5-12 last year. Safe to say it was a downgrade of a year. Amir, so much for the fact that I had their record going into last year as 12-5. I bought into the Chargers like you bought into the Dallas Cowboys. I thought that this was finally the year that they could put it together. But of course, they had a lot of injuries to save my case. They had a lot of injuries that held them back. But they had to get rid of guys like Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, guys that seem like franchise cornerstones, right? Especially Keenan Allen. Austin Eckler also left. So this offense looks completely different. They're going to be relying on Quentin Johnston as their number 1 wide receiver, and that dude couldn't catch the ball, and that's kind of his job. So hopefully going into year 2, they can either get a receiver or, maybe he develops into what he was at TCU. But your thoughts here about the Chargers? They've had a very interesting offseason. Maybe the biggest thing is that they have a new head coach there, Amir, in Jim Harbaugh. But your thoughts about the Chargers? Can they get Justin Herbert back on the right track and win some football games?
For this team, obviously they're disappointed and stuff like that. I mean, they probably have the worst defensive football. I've never seen, a team that loaded defensively and play that bad. But I'm gonna be buying this team just for the simple fact that you have your franchise quarterback, you have your guy, when he's healthy, he's arguably a top 5 quarterback. You go ahead and bring new coaches and you bring in Harbaugh, who had a successful, time in the NFL. And you go ahead and you get rid of the, Derek Ansley, which I think was terrible, a terrible defensive coordinator, and you bring in Mentor, which will be way better than he did. And so, you also have 36 million cap space. I think this team, I'm going to be buying the future, but, I'm going to be patient with them. I think it's not going to be this upcoming year. It's going to take a year or 2.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's where I'm going to be buying the fact as well in the LA Chargers. Just for the fact that I think Jim Harbaugh is going to change the identity here, Amir, because whether if it was with Colin Kaepernick when they were running the pistol or when he was with Michigan where they were just a run-heavy offense every single year, the identity is going to change here, just like the Bills kind of did midseason last year, Amir, where Josh Allen went from throwing 40 times a game to throwing 20 times a game, and they were still winning. In fact, winning more, with relying on guys like James Cook and preserving your quarterback. The identity is going to change here in LA. I will say that division, outside of the Chiefs, there's a lot of question marks around the Broncos and the Raiders. But the Chargers, they have the second best quarterback in the division, a top 10 quarterback in the league, no doubt about it. So interesting future for them. But just for all the mentions that you said with the defensive upgrades, I'm going to be buying the fact that they can, maybe not this year, but next year, like you mentioned, get back into that Super Bowl contention period or picture rather. But then we talk about your 2023 Super Bowl favorites, the Dallas Cowboys. Amir, 12-5. I had them at 12-5, and I said they're going to be 12-5, and they're going to lose in the first round of the playoffs. Of course, I'm going to leave out all of my bad takes in this video. So everyone want to relate to the past. I'm going to leave out my bad takes going into last season. But one of my good takes exactly was the Cowboys doing what they do every year, and that's to disappoint. But this year, uneventful offseason. They didn't really do anything but re-sign their long snapper. And now next year, they have a lot of big questions. Dak Prescott is up for contract, and the rumor says as of right now, Amir, next year is going to be his make it or break it year. Either he's going to lead them far into the playoffs, or they're going to get rid of him. That is kind of the rumor around Jerry Jones right now. CeeDee Lamb is up for contract. Again, a top 5, top 10 level wide receiver in the league. Micah Parsons, you can argue a top 3 defensive player in the league. He's also up for contract. They also have some other veterans on the team, key players that are all up for contract after next season. And it's not like restricted contracts. These are guys that are going to hit the open market. Amir, your thoughts about the Cowboys going into next year and years ahead? Can Jerry Jones use that bank account to revitalize this team?
I mean, this team is in a very, very bad situation, a very tough situation. And, I mean, honestly, I doubt, if they don't make it out the first round or make some noise this year, Dak is gone. I think CD is gone unless they pay him a huge bag. I think Michael Parsons is gone unless they pay him a huge bag. And, it'll be really tough to get these guys to stay. And, seeing this team over the past few years, seeing them completely fold, in the playoffs, I don't think it's necessarily a player thing, a Dak thing or a CD thing. I think it's more so a culture thing and a coaching thing. And, I think that's the biggest concern with this team. And so I'm going to be selling the future just because, I mean, going into this year, I don't see them, beating a team like Detroit, beating a team like San Fran, or even, dominating a team like Green Bay. And, after next year, I mean, they're a team that's going to completely, fall downhill after that. And so that's what I'm going to be selling.
Yeah, a lot of the same reasons there. My biggest thing was, and again, I'm not the biggest Mike McCarthy believer, but do I think he's an above average head coach? I do think he's an above average head coach, but for the simple fact that this team has the talent, but they haven't got over the hump. They needed an identity change, in my opinion, this offseason. And whether if that was simply just bringing Dan Quinn back to be your head coach, that could have been the small change that would have made me maybe be a believer for this team going into next year, but they didn't. And they're rolling it back, or they're running it back with the same exact team, basically. And without that identity change, it's going to be the same story. And again, it's not that I think that Mike McCarthy's a bad head coach, but I don't think he's the right guy for this team. And I'm worried about this team, Amir. I'm worried about this team going into next year. But the NFL's weird. This will be the year the Cowboys finally put it together with their backs against the wall and make some noise in the playoffs. But for the NFL, the selfish NFL fan in me, and as a podcast host, Amir, I want them to fail. I want them to fail. I want them to make a lot of noise, and I want some people to get traded. CeeDee Lamb and Michael Parsons. You can come over to Cleveland, man. We could use you. We could use you here in Cleveland, right? But they're talking about the Chicago Bears. They have the #1 pick. You know what that means? That means they're drafting a guy with pink nails, pink phone, and pink lip gloss. Caleb Williams, maybe the next Patrick Mahomes level quarterback. He is the pick in this draft. He's the can't miss prospect, and he's going to go #1 to the Chicago Bears. They were 7-10 last year, and again, a lot of those wins actually came in the second half of the year when Justin Fields turned it around. But he is now in Pittsburgh. They're moving on to Caleb Williams, and going into next year, they still have the same core. Of course, they re-signed Jalen Johnson. They brought back Montez, or they traded for an extended Montez Sweat, and they have 2 top 10 picks in this upcoming NFL draft. So interesting to see what they can do. But Amir, your thoughts? Can Caleb Williams be the real deal from day one with his loaded offense now in Chicago?
I keep seeing, a common theme of, people hating on, draft, hating on people, hating on players, hating on draft picks. And, I don't understand, it's good to hate on a player, but, separate, his personality from his game. And Caleb Williams is that guy. In my opinion, his game is legit. I think he's by far the best player in this draft.
Yes.
I think, he's going to come in and make an impact on this team. And, seeing as loaded as his offense is, seeing how great the defense played last year, I'm going to be buying this future. And they still have $23 million cap space. I mean, it's so much they can do with this team. So much they can do.
Yeah, especially because they have a solid offensive line now. Of course, some guys developed last year, guys like Darnell Wright, their first round pick from last year out of Tennessee, even though I hate the Vols. And of course, they can have a top 10 pick. So if they want to go out there and draft a left tackle, but I believe they believe in their offensive line at the moment. Of course, they also got Keenan Allen, we forgot to mention. This defense is solid. I would not be my ideal offseason for them, Amir, is to get Caleb Williams and then to
Yeah.
get Latu Latu. I'm a big believer in Latu Latu. I believe they would get the best quarterback and the best edge in the class. And to help out Montez Sweat on the defensive line, it's scary for these quarterbacks. And at that point, Jordan Love, I would hope that he can get some help up front. But I'm also going to be buying the fact that the Bears, might be ready to go from day one. I do have
Hmm.
some questions about Matt Eberflus, but this division, Amir, I can promise is going to be maybe the most interesting division outside of
Yeah.
the AFC North next season with a lot of new quarterbacks, a lot of new faces. Whether if it's with Minnesota, Detroit, Green Bay, or Chicago, it's going to be it's going to be the divisions to watch next year, the AFC and NFC North. Some other teams here that I'll be honest, I was lazy enough, and if you made it to this far into the video, hey, I didn't want to make graphics for these teams, but these were the final five or so teams that we had to mention. The Denver Broncos, we're both going to be selling their futures. Of course, they had Mr. Unlimited, a guy with an alter ego, and Russell Wilson. They signed him to maybe the worst contract in NFL history. It's up there with number 4 in Cleveland. But he's now on to bigger and better things. They took the dead cap hit, and they need a quarterback. They don't have a first round pick, or they have a first round pick. They don't have a second, and they don't have a third round pick until the late third. So there's a big gap. And right now they're in a position with that number 12 pick where the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks will be off the board. So they're either going to have to reach for a guy like Drake May, or not Drake May, excuse me, a guy like Bo Nix, Michael Penix, or you got to wait to the third round and maybe draft a quarterback then. Whatever they do, interesting offseason ahead. But Amir, your thoughts on the Broncos?
This team is going to be garbage going into this year. You know, I mean, it's crazy the fact that they're bringing Sean Payton, expecting an immediate turnaround. It's been nothing but falling apart. I think it's a cultural thing, and also them, managing contracts terribly. Them handling everything bad, and it all starts with that Russ contract.
Yeah.
And it's like now you have no cap space, you have no quarterback. You don't really have anything that's making you excited for the future. And so I'm going to be selling selling this, the stock on this team. And like you just mentioned, I mean, they're going to have to reach for a guy like Bo Nix or Michael Penix when in reality, I mean,
They're
in
probably
my
debut
opinion,
guys. Yeah. Second round picks.
exactly. So I'm going to be selling, for the future of this team.
Yeah, no, I will say that I actually kind of last year, I kind of made myself realize I like a lot of players on this Broncos team. I'm a big Cortland Sutton fan, of course, out of
Yeah.
SMU, big Javonte Williams fan out of UNC, and of course Pat Surtain. How can you not like PS2? I mean, not only does he
Yeah.
have the best nickname in the game, but of course best cornerback in the game by far. So I actually kind of realized I like a lot of players on this Denver Broncos team last year. But that doesn't change the fact that they have no quarterback at the moment. Unless you think Jarrett Stidham is the guy, I'm gonna cut to the chase. I don't believe he is. He's about to be as impactful as maybe like a Gardner Minshew, but maybe to a lesser degree because Gardner maybe should be a starter here in the NFL, Amir. But for the Broncos, I'm selling the fact as well. Moving over to the Seattle Seahawks, Amir, I'll give you the floor here. We're both going to be selling their futures. Some questions at quarterback. They have a new head coach. Maybe he brings a new identity, but they lost a lot of defensive pieces this offseason with this new defensive head coach being the guy coming over to try and save this franchise, at least steer them right back into the contention picture. But your thoughts about the Seattle Seahawks? Can they turn it around with the new head coach in the next 2 to 3 years?
So, I was kind of, in the middle between this team just because, I think, obviously, McDonald's, a defensive minded coach, a great defensive coach. And I think the defense will still be good, with arguably the best cornerback duo in the league. That's a good debate. And so, I think, and so, I think, this team, has some pieces defensively, to get better. But my biggest concern is the offense in the future. I think Geno isn't the guy. I also think, DK or Tyler Lockett is going to be gone soon. Kenneth Walker is great, but, I think this team, in the next year or two doesn't have enough, to move over the top, and it'll only be downhill from there. So I'll be selling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they do have the offense. I think, of course, they did bring Tyler Lockett back. He's going to be a for lifer there in Seattle, it seems like. Kenneth Walker, of course, very solid back, but you need help up front. I think they go out there in this draft here. I think they've picked number 16 and get some help off up front. Guys like Jackson Powers Johnson or Troy Faetanu, whatever they want to do. I think they're going to get some help in the interior offensive line. But again, we hear this phrase all the time, Amir. They're a quarterback away. But for the Atlanta Falcons, again, they speaking about Kirk Cousins, he signed here on a $180 million deal. Of course, they had a very solid defensive secondary last year. They can now pair that with a guy like Dallas Turner or a front seven guy here with their number 8 overall pick in the NFL draft. Of course, on the offensive side, we know what they have. They have Kyle Pitts, Bijan Robinson, two guys that have a lot of untapped potential. Of course, they have a new head coach here coming in for the Atlanta Falcons, getting rid of the worst head coach in football. Of course, they're in Arthur Smith. But your thoughts about the Falcons? Can they finally get these younger guys ready to push them over the top?
Yeah, this team will be, a really good team this year. I mean, like you just mentioned, they have all these young pieces, all these pieces in untapped potential that's waiting to release. I'm expecting a guy like Kyle Pitts to have, all pro,
2,000
Pro
yards.
Bowl, exactly, this year. And it's crazy. I mean, his rookie year, I think he had what 900, almost 1,000 yards,
Yeah.
effortlessly. And coming into this year, he finally has that quarterback. I'm going to be buying this future. Obviously, the biggest concern that I have is that contract with Kirk Cousins. If these guys pan out or do good, how are you going to pay these guys long term? But I mean, this year, they'll have no problem winning, 9, 10 games easily.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, some people are worried about the injury of Kirk Cousins. What was it, an ACL or an Achilles? I think it was
Achilles.
it was Achilles.
Yeah.
Regardless, he's not a guy that's mobile, just like Aaron Rodgers. So these guys are going to come back, and they should be good from day one. Of course, after getting fully cleared medically, they should be good because they're not Lamar Jackson. They're not guys that rely on their athleticism remotely at all. So they should be fine from day number one. For the Arizona Cardinals, Amir, I'm going to give you the floor here. Of course, I'm a big Kyler Murray fan. I would grab the figurine behind me, but I don't want to today. But again, they have the number 4 overall pick. They could trade back and get more assets, but they have like I think 2 or 3 second round picks. The number 4 overall pick, or they have 2 first, 2 second, I believe, is the what I'm getting at here. So they have a lot of capital coming up here in a couple weeks to turn this team back in the right direction. But they also have just as many holes outside of the quarterback position. And some could argue that that's not, the guy to take them over the top. But your thoughts about the Cardinals and why are you selling here going forward?
No, I'm going to be selling because I mean, you just mentioned a great fact. They have a lot of draft capital, and to kind of fill these voids, but they also have a lot of holes, a lot of missing pieces. And personally, I think if they don't, do something, for Kyler these upcoming years, I think he's going to walk. I think he's going to be gone. And you obviously have this draft capital, but I mean, I think you barely have any cap space as it is. And that's a huge concern too, to where it's like Kyler wants to win. He doesn't want to spend another year only winning 4 games, 5 games. Like he wants to, win some games, possibly be in the playoff picture. I mean, like, Kyler in his biggest year, I mean, they went and made the playoffs, made some noise.
Yeah.
And for him to, kind of take a huge step back this much, I think he's going to walk, and this team is going to be, kind of doomed for years to come. So I'm saying selling.
Can you imagine him in like Miami? I think Miami would be like
That would
eh,
be great.
crazy, crazy for the Dolphins. But for the Raiders, we're going to be selling stock in them as well. Of course, Antonio Pierce, they brought him back. All right, a huge move, I think, for them because it was a culture changer. They bring in guys like Christian Wilkins. They still have Mad Max Crosby. They do have some questions in their secondary. In fact, 4 of them, right? We aren't sure about anybody in that secondary. And also at the quarterback position. They got rid of Jimmy Garoppolo, but they brought back in a guy on the same level tier in Gardner Minshew. But again, they're at I think pick 12 or 13. They're in a situation where they could trade up for one of these top guys in the NFL draft. So a very interesting future for them coming up. But again, hey, maybe Jaden Daniels is their guy, Amir, right? Antonio Pierce was with Jaden Daniels in ASU. Now he could be his head coach at the next level. But your thoughts here about the Raiders? Do you think they can finally get it going in the right direction?
No, I mean, I think this team is just a meh team. Obviously last year, with Antonio Pierce, once he took over, you kind of saw flashes of this team, playing for their coach. Antonio Pierce kind of had like a Dan Campbell type effect, right? They play the Chiefs really well both games, and this team shows some promises, but I mean, this team doesn't have enough talent.
Yeah.
Doesn't have enough. Especially against in that division, a team like KC who's getting even better. The Chargers team is going to get even better, and so I'm going to be selling. And the biggest concern is that quarterback position. Do they get Jan Daniels? We don't know yet. A guy like that. I'm going to be selling because this team just doesn't have enough.
Yeah, no, I mean the Raiders for me, there's just not really anything offensively outside of Devontae
Yeah.
Adams. He has been kind of wanting out of Las Vegas anyway. So very interesting to see if they can keep him happy because again, next year, well, I think they're really just in a position now where they're just gonna be, they're gonna be one of those next purgatory teams like the Seahawks, where they're gonna win probably anywhere from 6 to 10 games. Well, not 10, but 6 to 9 games. Be right, barely even make the playoffs or right outside. They're just always going to be a team that's good, not great. But, I don't know. The Raiders are in a very interesting position, but I think getting that head coach was huge for him, especially if he's going to change that culture. But who knows? Maybe Mad Max Crosby hits 30 sacks next season. Moving over to the close here, episode 155 in the books. On Tuesday, next Tuesday, I'm going to be talking about NBA playoff X factors. We might have a special guest on the show, maybe not. But again, regardless, we're going to be talking about some X factors going into the playoffs next week on Tuesday. Next Thursday, Amir, we're not sure what we're going to do yet. We could be doing some draft stuff. We could be doing some defensive stuff. You guys got to tune in next Thursday for whatever we do. Maybe I'll release a spoiler, right? But Amir, your final thoughts before we get out of here.
Man, free agency, was a very interesting free agency. We kind of been talking about this week by week, and the NFL is really, really top heavy now. It's really heavy at the top and kind of, goes to the bottom very, very bad. Honestly, I think it's great that way. I think this is going to be, the greatest. This might be the most entertaining year we've seen in a few years. There's so much talent, so much competition. I'm excited.
It's not that I'm not excited for the next 4 months of off-season talk. But I'm excited for when September comes around because last year in September, Amir, I went through everyone's schedule and I predicted them. I'm excited if you're going to be doing that here with us in September. Yeah. That's something I'm very excited to do here, where just you go through the schedules, you make your predictions, and of course, award predictions and all that's always fun as well. But until September, we're going to get by with some other amazing content. But before we get out of here, of course, drop a like, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you guys on Tuesday. But until then, stay happy, stay healthy. We're out of here.